So the story that I'm going to share occurred over the course of several years and only recently ended. It affected almost all of the most important people in my life, affecting us even today and likely for the rest of our lives too. I wanted to share it so that everyone can understand just how out of control a seemingly harmless situation can become. But due to the length of this event too, I'll likely break this story up into several parts. But first, let me lay it out for you. So my brother has always been my closest friend. He is easily the most loving and genuine person that I've ever met and is loved by pretty much everyone he meets. Despite this though, he hasn't been in many relationships. I think it's partly due to the fact that he's a very all-or-nothing type of guy. But when he falls deeply and blindly. A blessing and a curse, I guess. Anyway, the few girlfriends he's had, I've known quite well, despite being nearly 8 years younger than him too. Most of them have been nice and normal pleasant girls, with the exception of a few, of course. We had high hopes that he'd settle in with a long-term wonderful girlfriend as he entered his adult life. We had no idea, though, that we'd spend 6 years sharing a hell with him, our family, and our close friends, all by the hands of one girl. I'll call her Pam. So, I met Pam when I was 11 and my brother was 19 and she was 17, graduating high school. I remember being surprised to have him introduce her right off the bat as his girlfriend, since neither my parents or I had heard anything about her. But she was kind, warm, an honest student, and really beautiful too. And I admired her immediately. For the first year of their relationship too, Pam just never seemed off. She was always happy, always kind, and always had her stories to tell. She and I grew closer too, as she seemed eager to bond with me, and it was like having an older sister. We shared many of the same interests, and friendship came easy between she and I, as I was mature for my age and as she was so inviting. But halfway through their second year of dating, we started noticing things about Pam. Just small, odd habits that she had. If someone was having conversations with my brother that did not directly involve her or that she wasn't a part of, she tended to insert herself as best as she could, sitting closer to my brother, laughing a little louder and calling him away, etc. If any of our family or friends would ask my brother questions about college or future aspirations, she'd grow increasingly uncomfortable and sometimes make comments like, "I hope you have it all planned out, because I'm going where you're going," and just stuff like that. But my parents and I would chuckle about these behaviors, assuming that Pam just loved my brother and was a bit protective. We liked her a lot and had high hopes for their relationship, in fact, and I hate to think now just how blind we were. So, one night, my brother came home late from a party. I was 13 at the time, and he was about to turn 21. He walked in the door. Our parents were already asleep, but I was up in the living room, and I could just immediately tell that he was upset about something. I asked him what was wrong, and as he walked into the kitchen, I realized that he had a large welt on his cheek. I asked, "What happened to you?" and he said that he got in a fight and it's cool. This immediately raised suspicions, as my brother was as far from the fighting type as you could be. I asked him what the fight was over, and he said Pam, simply, and then just went to his room. The next morning, he was driving me to my soccer game, and I pried again about what had happened. He didn't answer at first, but then said, "Pam is kind of weird." I asked how so, and he said, "I don't know, she just likes to start things." Pam was a pathological liar. Apparently, she did it all the time, and looking back, the constant new stories of places that she'd been and things that she'd done it didn't seem to be truthful. That night at the party, Pam had told my brother that another man at the party had attempted to rape her. My brother, being the man that he is, confronted him and said, "I've never even seen her before." And a fight ensued over the accusation. On the car ride home, Pam said that my brother must have misinterpreted her words and that nothing close to rape had occurred. The lying seemed to be a detrimental bump in the road, and my brother broke things off at this point. After several weeks, Pam contacted me asking if I wanted to go shopping with her. Having had a good relationship in the past with Pam, I agreed, and my parents thought that it was strange that a 20-year-old wanted to spend time with her ex-boyfriend's 14-year-old sister, but they let me go anyway. The day started pleasantly, and Pam caught me up in her life and asked how I was and how my family and brother were, and nothing seemed strange, until she began to bring up uncomfortable conversations. She explained to me that she had had a sexually traumatic childhood, and that's why she'd lied so much. But she also aggressively defended herself, saying, "Whatever your brother told you was a lie. He was the one telling lies. That's why I had to break up with him." She seemed to jerk around the conversation from normal to deeply personal and just really strange topics. She explained in detail a lesbian experience that she had after ending her relationship with my brother and told me that I should try it when I come of age. I became increasingly uncomfortable with the conversation, and she noticed and immediately apologized, saying that she really liked being my friend and that she loved my brother and that's why she was acting so crazy. I told her that I liked being her friend too and that I understood her feelings, but this was a massive mistake, because this is when the phone calls began. It started with just one. She called me a week after we had hung out at 10 p.m. She was sobbing and saying that she was so sad about my brother and that she needed to get him back and all that type of stuff. Then they happened nightly, later and later each time. I'd be dead asleep at 2 a.m. and receive a sobbing and hysterical and desperate phone call. I felt so much pity for her that I continued to answer too. But one call was different than the other though. She wasn't hysterical and she wasn't crying, and I picked up the phone at 1:30 in the morning and I heard a leveled voice, a monotone Pam. And then she said one sentence: "Tell your brother that I'm going to slit my fucking throat tonight." And then she hung up. Honestly, I felt numb. I mean, I'd never experienced anything like that before, and no one I knew had ever behaved that way too. I texted her just over and over again, asking if she was okay and telling her not to do anything. I panicked and I thought that I had done something wrong and that since she told me that I would be responsible in some way. The next day, I told my brother what had happened and he said that he'd go to her house to check on her. A week later, Pam arrived at my house, arm in arm with my brother. They had gotten back together and seemed as if nothing had happened. She smiled at me and never once mentioned the phone calls that she had made to me. And the next month is when things escalated again. So I came home from school to my entire family sitting in the living room. They told me to sit down and, honestly, I thought someone had died at that point. My mother then told me that your brother let us know how you're feeling. Obviously, I had no idea what they were talking about. So I asked, "Feeling?" My brother looked at me with pity in his eyes and said Pam told me that she wasn't the one who called you, you called her, and you're the one who wasn't feeling well. I said, "No, that's not what happened. She called me every night for 2 weeks crying and saying that she wanted you back." They said, "That's not what she said. She said that you called her with your problems and that she wasn't sure what to do." I was immediately angry that her lies were continuing and that my own family believed them enough to stage an intervention of some sort. I showed them the text messages that she had sent to me and played the voice messages and showed my call history, and that, thankfully, put an end to that lie. After that, I wanted nothing to do with her, and my brother broke up with her again. She called him hundreds of times and sent hundreds of messages too. She showed up at our house a few times with baked goods, wanting to apologize, but we just ignored her. And eventually, she just left us alone and we didn't hear from her for almost a year. On my last day of class before winter break during my sophomore year, I walked out of school and was met by an incredibly unwelcome surprise. And this is where things got a little scary. Pam was pacing in front of the school and biting her fingernails and scratching her head. Her face looked sunken in and she had huge bags under her eyes. And to be honest, I almost didn't recognize her. I began to cut across the front lawn with my friend Liz to avoid her, but she saw me and walked as fast as she could in my direction. She outreached her arms for a hug, but I stopped, and the first thing that she said was, "You're mad at me." I asked her what she was doing there, and she laughed quietly. She said, "I wanted to apologize for whatever your brother told you. I'm sick." She also used a nickname that only my brother called me. I said, "I know, please don't talk to me anymore." And I started away, knowing that my brother was parked waiting for me around the corner. Pam reached out and grabbed my shoulder as I did, and I quickly pulled away and said, "I'm serious, just leave me alone. I think you need some help, Pam." And she immediately began to cry, but I turned away and just left. My brother pulled into the front of the parking lot of the school and opened his car door for me, and he looked through his front mirror and said, "Is that fucking Pam?" And I said, "Yeah, I don't know what she's on, but she's crazy." That night, at around 1 a.m., there was a knock at our door. My dad went to it and looked through the peephole, and he said, surprised, "I think that's fucking Pam." My brother said, "Don't open it. I think she's doing drugs." My mum wanted to call the police at this point, but my brother and my dad said that we should just wait until she just went away. A few minutes later, she rapped on the door harder and more violently this time. We heard her wailing and yelling, and she said something like, "I hear you, fucking let me in," and as she cried, my brother said, "She has a baseball bat or something." He was coming from his room, so he was looking out of his window and could see her better. I looked from the den window, and she looked like something out of a horror movie. She was wearing a grubby dress, she was barefoot, her hair had been cut just above her shoulders, and it was wild and halfway in a bun, just halfway out of mess. She had wiped her makeup down her face like a ghoulish movie character. She looked even thinner than she did in daylight, and she was swinging a baseball bat around, a metal one, I think, as she stumbled about our yard. My mum said at this point, "I'm calling the police, she must be drunk or something." We said, though, that it was fine, that she's just giving a show and she'll leave. We didn't know people actually behaved like this. It was eerily entertaining for us, kind of, and it was like watching a crime show or something. But just as she had been manically stumbling around, she suddenly just stopped, and she stood still, just staring vacantly up towards the upstairs bedrooms, tilting her head side to side and up and down, and then licking her lips. My dad asked, "What the hell is she on?" And Pam began to shift back and forth between laughing and yelling and crying. We all sat down as my brother tried her phone and her mum's phone to try and get her to leave. We sat there and listened to the frightening animalistic sounds of her outside. But then they just stopped. We checked the window, and at this point, she was gone. We all sat in silence for a moment, just taking in the strange encounter. My father just chuckled and shook his head, and my mother shook hers, pitying the girl for being so disturbed. But I must admit that I was frightened. No one, except perhaps my brother, had seen just how quickly her demeanor, her mental state had unraveled. From an overprotective nature, to small lies, to pathological lies, to full-blown manic outbreaks like this. But this was the worst so far, and we didn't expect anything more to come out of it, that she'd just fade away from our lives, since now she knew that we weren't going to give in to her desperation. But in the next 2 years, we learned just how wrong we were. After the wintertime incident at our house, Pam just stopped coming around. She was still very present, however, and every member of my family endured daily text messages and phone calls, and they ranged from apologetic and stable to incredibly distraught or outraged and cursing and making threats and just everything. I remember wanting to sleep with the lights on for several months after the incident too, afraid that she'd climb the fence of our backyard and I'd find her standing at my window with the same vacant, crazed look that she had that night in our front yard. All four of us eventually decided to have our phone numbers changed and blocked her from our devices and social media accounts too. She still had her home phone number, however, and Pam left some of the most frightening and just haunting messages that I'd ever heard. I can remember standing in my kitchen with my family, my brother playing the messages back for us, and one of them stood out. It showed us just how unstable and potentially dangerous she actually was. So my parents and I had returned from an early morning indoor soccer game in February of 2015. My brother asked us to come to the kitchen because we had to hear the new crazy Pam had become. The first message was about 30 seconds long, I'd say, and received at 12:30 a.m. in the night before. Pam sounded mildly angry and demanded that we return the batch of cookies she had brought to our 4th of July party some years ago, because she didn't want us to have them anymore. We all exchanged humorous glances at how ridiculous of a request it was. My mother turned to leave, amused, but my brother stopped her, saying that wasn't the crazy part. My brother played the message, received at roughly 3 in the morning that day, but we were confused at first because the first 15 seconds was just white noise. The kind you hear when a device plays a sound recording of an empty room, if you know what I'm talking about. But all of a sudden, in a deep, animalistic and enraged voice, she screamed, "Stop fucking playing with me, you're gonna get it," and abruptly ended the call. We were all a little bit startled by this. I ended up saying that I wanted to call the police because they need to know that that girl just isn't all there and who knows what she can do. My dad decided that if anything physically happened again, that we'd file a report with the police, but that they were just phone calls at this point. My brother assured that she was all talk and wouldn't come around again. At this point, I no longer felt safe though. I had never been around someone who behaved like this, and I was constantly anxious, and I had no idea what I'd do if she came around again. I felt like I was stuck in a Lifetime movie, because I didn't think that things like this actually happened, that someone I knew so personally could be hiding such a deeply withheld violent and manic side. It had always been there too, but we set it in motion. After disconnecting the landline, the personal phone call stopped. We didn't hear from her ourselves, but some of the friends my brother shared with Pam would come to him saying that Pam wanted to speak with him and that she would call and message them regularly wanting his phone number. Luckily, none of them gave it though. And just before summer, Pam disappeared. No one got any messages and no one saw her in town, and there was just nothing. Nothing until my brother received an email from Pam's mother, who my brother continued to speak to occasionally. She informed my brother that Pam's family had moved her to the East Coast to undergo treatment for a drug habit. Pam's mother had given us more information about the mental state of her daughter. Her mother had not spoken to her or seen Pam much during the time that she unraveled, when she came to our house or when she'd made the phone calls, that is. Pam's mother had been under the impression that my brother was still in a healthy relationship with Pam and only learned about their breakup and the incidents following it later. She explained that her daughter had always been a white liar, making up stories that just didn't make sense and blaming others for things that she had already been caught for, arguing the truth of things that were already proven facts. She told us that I don't think she ever thought that anything she did was wrong, even when it was. I don't understand it because she just wasn't raised that way. Pam's issues were something that had always been present though, but settled comfortably beneath an intelligent and attractive exterior. And she sure fooled us, and maybe even herself. But without Pam to worry about, our lives seemed to go back to normal. I still looked over my shoulder every now and again, but I was preparing for 11th grade and my brother was beginning a new career and dating a new girl. the daughter of a close family friend who he'd grown up with. Pam just started to fade away from our minds at this point, for a while at least. As myself and my friends began to drive, I remember noticing a car quite a bit. You know that car that you see repeatedly around the area that you live in? You notice it more than others because you notice it once and now you can't stop noticing it since you know it exists. You know it belongs to someone, but you've never seen the driver, just the car. It was like that, and I'd noticed it out of the corner of my eye at a stoplight or at the window of a restaurant as I drove past, and I didn't think much of it, but I noticed it pretty much every time I was out, walking, driving, and many times with my brother too. I didn't understand how often I'd seen it until one day it just clicked, and it kind of startled me. In fact, it scared me. I saw it parked in my neighborhood, and I remember thinking, that's that fucking car, what is it doing here? But we live in a smaller and older neighborhood. Most of the people who lived there had been there for a long time at this point, and we knew a lot of the neighbors and houses, and they pretty much were never on the market. New people showed up maybe once every 5 or so years, and when they did, most people knew about it, so it was out of place, but also oddly familiar. I pointed it out to my brother, who had been in the car with me at the time, and he said, "Oh yeah, I've seen it a few times." It didn't feel right about it, but I assumed that I was just being paranoid. A few months later, I was well into school and had a job and was just too busy to let myself worry, even though I kind of did at the back of my mind, and then one day at work, I was wiping down some tables in the front of the restaurant as it was a pretty slow day and only a few people in the store, and I remember seeing someone standing outside the front doors, just barely visible out the window. I was busy and just assumed that they were deciding where to have lunch, as another restaurant was directly next to ours and people did this often. And when I turned around, they just weren't there anymore, and I assumed that they'd gone next door. I went out to clear the dishes off the front patio and clean up, and I saw them walking away from the store, down the strip of the businesses in the plaza. Back inside as I worked, I noticed the same person walked back and forth several more times. I was wary at this point because the person seemed to linger for over an hour, but I didn't think anything of it afterwards, and I just kind of let it go again. I was a theatre student and had to take some time off for a play I was in too, and come opening night, I was just totally burnt out, and I didn't notice anything, even if it was out of the ordinary. But my family came to the opening night, the 4th show, and closing night too. And leaving with my family from the 4th show is when I snapped back into my anxiety-ridden reality. That car was in the parking lot. It was parked a few rows away from my parents' car, and I had never seen it at my school before, and I knew that it didn't belong to any of my classmates. I asked my brother, "What does Pam drive?" And he said that he didn't know, and why, and I said, "That stupid car, it kind of freaks me out because it's like everywhere that we are." A few days later, I had an answer too. At closing night of my show, I went out into the lobby of the theatre to greet everyone when we finished. I hugged my parents and my brother, but I noticed that they all looked distraught. My brother was visibly upset, and my parents were trying to make conversation, the way that they do to avoid something. I asked what happened, and they said that Pam was here, and I sort of felt the colour run out of my face. I asked them, did she leave, and my brother said, "I don't know, don't worry about it." I went and got my things and remembered how strangely violated I felt. That Pam had watched me for the past 2 hours without me even knowing that she was in the same state, let alone the same building as me. I decided to go home straight away after that, and we left the building, and there she was. She was looking at her phone, just standing at the mouth of one of the hallways in front of the theatre. I stopped for a moment, but the 4 of us decided to walk as hurried as we could towards the parking lot, hoping to ignore her and breeze past her. And she looked different. Still skinny, but she wore makeup again. From a distance, she almost looked like the old Pam, but as we got closer, She looked up from her phone and she still had the vacant animal quality to her face. A bit of anger flashed over her face as she noticed us too, and she looked like she was going to say something, but we all pretended not to notice her and just continued on. She followed closely behind us and said, "Hey, wait a minute." At the front of the school, my brother stopped as we were walking, and I heard him say, "You need to stop." We got to our car and watched them talk from a distance, and I wanted to get in our car and just leave, and my mum and I got in while my dad stood outside. Pam was yelling at my brother at this point, and he made his way towards his car, and Pam smiled artificially and waved towards my brother, shouting goodbye to him as he went before storming off to a car. My brother stopped to talk to my dad for a moment and got in his own car and left after Pam peeled out of the lot. And it was in the same car that I'd been seeing for the past month and a half. "Welp, just as crazy as ever," my dad said as he started the car. "We may need to call the police this time." We lived a short distance from school, but I was shaken up and wanted my dad to drive as fast as possible. Every headlight that we saw chilled me, and I stared at my phone trying not to look out the window, and I nearly dropped it. We reached a street convergence in our neighborhood. At the top of the sign to the right of us was her car. I said, "Dad, that's her car," and he drove straight and she turned the same direction. I said, "Dad, she's following us," and I'd never felt quite so panicked. At this point, my dad said to call the police to my mum, and his voice was really level. I stared out the back window, ducking low on my seat, and my dad turned another street and she followed again. My dad said that he was going to go in a circle to see if she followed us, and I was crying at this point as I came to a realization. For 4 more turns, my mum spoke to a 911 operator, unable to accurately name streets as they were not lit and it was pitch black outside. I laid across the back seat listening to my parents yell at each other, frustrated, and I'm frightened, and my dad curses as she continues to follow more closely. The car was flooded with light as she turned on her brights, and the grille of her car almost touched our bumper. My dad turned the mirror away to keep the light out of his eyes and sped the car up. Eventually, the light was gone and I could no longer hear the drone of her engine behind us because she was gone. We got home 10 minutes later and turned every light on in our house. My dad checked every closet in our back and side yards, carrying his gun with him all the time. I was almost hysterical in my realization too that she'd been watching me and my brother this whole time. For the past month, Pam had been stalking both my brother and I. Seeing that car had not been a coincidence. She knew what we were both doing, and she came to my school function on both nights that my family were there, and maybe all 3 nights in fact. She knew where I was, and she had followed me all over town. She'd been around our neighborhood and had been there just lurking around my workplace. All of a sudden, too, the threats, they became real. Pam was no longer afraid of crossing boundaries if she ever had been. We were now in the middle of a full-blown nightmare, and my family was no longer safe. She had gone away to cure one disease, but apparently returned having fed and grown another. She was our personal nightmare, with the power to single-handedly pull our everyday lives apart, and she had already begun to do just that. What may have seemed like the plot of a bad horror movie, the psychotic ex-girlfriend wreaking havoc, it became our reality, times 10. I can not express to you how terrible it was to be kept awake by something that you can't see, but you know exists and is waiting for you when you get out of bed. I never expected a human being could terrify me more than any horrible monster or boogeyman. I mean, those things don't exist. And I'm sharing this ordeal to help others understand warning signs and pressure those who see them to take action to protect themselves. Despite the terror of that night, though, this was only halfway through year 5 of 6, and things would continue to approach a boiling point. After we told my brother about what Pam had done that night after my show, he finally began to confide in me the details of his relationship with Pam. She had come to his high school as a sophomore during his senior year. She immediately caught the attention of my brother and his friends, as she was beautiful and expected to be reserved as a new student. However, my brother recalled his female friend saying that she was aggressive in trying to make friends and liked to talk about how her family had moved here from an affluent community in Texas, so elite that it didn't even have a name. Many of his friends had also gotten a strange vibe from her and pinned her as weird and a snobby girl right away. My brother met her again a few years later when she came into where he was working at the time and said how she seemed to mature vastly. He took her on a date, and almost immediately she wanted to officiate their relationship. He thought it was a bit forward, but didn't hesitate because she impressed him with her elegant way of speaking, kind words, and pretty face. However, he noticed red flags only a few weeks into their relationship. Pam was very insecure, constantly asking my brother if he still had feelings for her, if he was angry with her, and if he thought that she was attractive enough. Eventually, this insecurity took a different shape too. Pam would send my brother unsolicited nude pictures of herself in the middle of the day, attached to messages asking if he still liked the way her body looked. If my brother went a period of time in their conversation without calling her beautiful or telling her how nice she looked, Pam would point this out too. And if he protested in any way, she'd become emotional and claim that he didn't love her anymore. This behavior mellowed until the end of the second year of their relationship, and this is when the narcissism became apparent. Pam would often talk lowly of my brother's previous girlfriends and female friends, boasting about how much more attractive she was than them. Pam refused to attend several of the events that my brother asked her to go to, like my birthday dinner or aunt's funeral, because she wouldn't know anyone and would have no one to talk to. She also enjoyed referring to herself as a princess and wanting to constantly be doted upon. She often argued with my brother about him spending time with his friends without her because she didn't understand why he wanted to be around anyone but her. She was 100% convinced that she would one day be a celebrity and marry my brother. At this point, I was in disbelief that my brother, a smart and kind good-looking man, was wasting any more of his time with a girl who behaved like that. However, anytime my brother hinted at wanting to end the relationship, Pam would fly off the handle, becoming belligerent and promising to kill herself. My brother was trapped by the fear of her harming herself, and he'd often think that she was simply bluffing and wouldn't actually do anything, but one day he discovered several bottles of prescription pills in Pam's home. He asked her about them, and she told him that they were antidepressants prescribed to her after the death of her brother, a brother who he later found out never even existed. Eventually, Pam began to become angry when my brother would want to spend time with his family without her around. He also told me that Pam fixated a lot of that anger on me. Once, she proceeded to refer to me as a slut and made comments and theories about how my mother must have had an affair of which I was the product, because I was so ugly and my brother was not. So my brother decided that it was time to end it, no matter what. This information troubled me, as all of her actions following that, asking me to spend time with her, she wanting me to be her friend, showing up to my school on the phone calls, they seemed heinous now and ill-intended and even more psychotic than they had been at the time. But for the final year and a half of our ordeal with Pam, psychotic could not begin to explain what she did to us. So I slept very little in the weeks following the car incident. My brother, who lived across town, visited and called me regularly, though. I suspected that he felt uneasy as I did. The nights I did sleep, I often sweat through dreams of girls with axes or women standing at the front of my bed or in my window or whatnot. One night, in early December of 2015, it was a rainy and particularly windy night. I wanted to let the cold air in, and I thought that the sound of rain would help me sleep, so I cracked the window just only enough to where I could reach the second latch, and I also placed the piece of wood that my father had cut to help with security behind the window. I pulled my curtain in front of the window, leaving the cracked part of the window uncovered to allow air to pass the heavy blackout curtain. I remember waking from sleep, vaguely hearing a foreign noise against the roof out of my window. My room was on the second floor of our house, and our house had 3 levels, and the second story was only 6 or 7 steps up from the primary floor of our house. All of the spaces were different levels, but the bedrooms were the highest, slightly lower than they'd be in a classic 2-story home. What I'm getting at is that my room was hard to get to from the outside, but not if you were aware of the parts of our home and access points from other roof levels over the living room and a garage. But I shook the noise off as it was storming, and I thought maybe some leaves or branches were just moving around. I turned over to face the wall opposite of my window, and not even a second later, my room was illuminated by a surge of white light. I shot up in bed, and I was momentarily paralyzed with horror. Every one of my limbs felt as if they were floating as I tried to make sense of what had happened. Then, again, myself and every item in my room became a black silhouette as another flash filled the space. I threw the blankets off of me and ran as fast as I could down the hallway. I was screaming so loud that I surprised myself, and I ran into my dad as he threw open his bedroom door. He was panicked and held me by my shoulders in the doorway to their bedroom and yelled at me to tell him what was wrong. I told him that someone was taking pictures of me through my window. The roof and the house were checked, and they, of course, found nothing and found no one. My mother sat up with me and asked every basic question a parent asks, like, were you dreaming? Make sure it wasn't lightning? But there was no thunder, though, and I was sure that there had not been at the time that it happened, too. The flashes didn't have the same hue as lightning did, too, and I had taken enough cell phone pictures in my life to identify the flash of a camera. I don't know if they believed me then, but I would eventually have proof that would astonish them. So my brother adopted, in January of 2016, I think it was, Ike, who was a 2-month-old bay retriever with one gold eye and one green eye. He had a very distinct white marking on his chest that looked like an hourglass and a white sock in his front left paw. And Ike was the love of my brother's life, aside from his now fiancée, Cara. And Ike would end our torture just 3 months later. The holidays of my brother's engagement to Cara, who was amazing and beautiful and whose family we had known all of our lives, had lifted my family's spirits immensely. My brother was starting his family, almost done with the police academy, and seemed untouchable by any memory of Pam at this point. We honestly felt optimistic for the first time in a long time. Pam hadn't been around, to our knowing at least, in several weeks, and all was normal and things were looking up. But that again didn't last. A month or so after bringing him home, after letting him into the backyard for a few minutes by himself, Cara told us that Ike had escaped from the yard. She obviously panicked and ran around the neighborhood looking for him, and she got in her car and called me upset and drove around the block looking for him. She picked me up and I helped her look in the creek area where my brother's house was, and we just couldn't find him anywhere. However, when we arrived back at my brother's house, Ike was sitting on the front porch. We were relieved, obviously, as he was unharmed and seemed to be as happy as ever, despite missing his collar. I helped Cara check the yard for ways that he could have gotten out, and we both decided that he must have shimmied through a small gap in the gate on the side of the yard or something. But I just couldn't help but be confused to find no grass or burrs in his fur or anything. But we didn't think anything of it, and we just kind of let it go. A few weeks later, both my brother and Cara were going on a weekend trip with some friends, and I offered to take care of Ike. They dropped him off on Friday before the 3-day weekend, and Ike was happy to play with our older lab, Des. The second night that he was with us, I was out with my friends, and my dad had let both the dogs into the yard at around 8 p.m. He sat in his chair in the living room, just watching a show with my mum, and they say that they remembered hearing Des barking because he yelled for him to be quiet, but they assumed the puppy was riling him up or something. A few minutes later, Des came to the door to be let in. He ran inside and barked at my dad, and my dad was confused as our dog was not a regular barker. He called for Ike, but he didn't come. My dad went out and looked around in the bushes and still couldn't find him, and he became concerned and hurried into the house to get a light. He checked the swimming pool first and still didn't find him, and my mother joined him, and they both scoured the large yard, but they couldn't find him anywhere. When I got home, they had just finished searching the front yard and side yards, and I told them that he had escaped once before, so we decided to take the car to look for him. As we drove around yelling for him, attracting the help of a few neighbors, I thought how strange it was that such a well-behaved puppy had just suddenly become a master escape artist in the past 3 or so weeks. Our yard had seen 3 or so dogs grow up in it too, some younger and smaller than Ike too, and we had never had this problem. The fences were high and well built, and my dad had replaced the ones at the side of the house just a few summers ago. And we didn't find Ike. I hoped that he would return that night, like he did the last time, but he didn't. I informed my brother on Sunday and proceeded to look all day in the surrounding areas. The pond, the shelters, vet clinics, the pound, and even looked to the side of the roads for bodies, and we didn't find anything. My brother was obviously heartbroken, and I helped him make flyers to post in a neighborhood and his. A couple of weeks passed, and we don't hear anything. So my dad was doing yard work in mid-February, and he came in after a few hours and he set something on the kitchen table. I said, "What's that?" and I knit my brows as I saw it. He said that it was Ike's collar and that it was in the front yard, and I almost hit it with the mower. "You'll have to take it to your brother." It was Ike's collar, but it was his first collar. Not the one that he'd been wearing the night that he went missing from our yard. It was his puppy collar, which he had lost the day that he got out of the yard at my brother's house. I called Kara and asked her if they ever found it, and they said that they hadn't and had brought him a new one. And that's when it clicked. Someone had stolen my brother's dog not once, but twice. I told my brother, Kara, and my parents my theory, and it was not a difficult one for them to understand. It had to be connected to everything else, right? But we decided to take it to the police to add to our case file on Pam. I also told them about the night that I had been photographed from my window. The police, like many times before, told us that they couldn't do anything as there was no proof that she had done any of these things, and frustrated and defeated and frightened again, we left. But a few short weeks later, in April of 2016, new developments would finally end it all. By just complete God-sent coincidence, Kara was with her mother in a small town about 45 minutes away from ours. But we were planning for my 17th birthday that month, and we were so preoccupied that we almost put Pam and the fact that she undoubtedly had been watching us for months and had stolen and probably killed my brother's puppy and thrown his collar in our front yard to help us connect the dots and give her credit for the crime out of our minds. However, while Kara window shopped in the center of the town, she and her mother noticed a car parked on the street. A car with a puppy in it. It was a bit warm out, so they walked to the window and peeked in at the animal. And Kara immediately recognized him by his eyes and the markings on his chest, and the fact that he began crying as soon as she called his name and he saw her. She phoned the police and phoned my brother and sat on the back trunk of the car. The police arrived as the owner of the car came back to it. The girl was immediately upset by the presence of the police and Kara's angry accusations. The girl was not Pam, and she became rather helpful too. The girl said that she had purchased the dog only a few days ago from an ad online. She told the police that the girl she had purchased it from was super shady and eager to get rid of the dog, who was skinny and a very cheap price. The girl had sold her the dog and claimed that she didn't want the stupid dog. It was a present from her boyfriend, but it was the wrong kind. Pam had always liked small dogs, and she told the police that she had met the girl to purchase the dog in an apartment complex a few minutes from where they were, but she wasn't sure what apartment the girl lived in. The police, after Kara had informed them of our situation, used Pam's name to find out that she indeed lived in the apartment complex with 2 roommates. They interviewed Pam's roommates the next day, but Pam was not there. They told detectives that they almost never saw Pam, and her room was always locked, and she was almost always gone. She didn't have a job, though she claimed to have one, and her mother was there a lot checking up on her and dropping off her rent to them. However, when they did speak to her, she talked a lot about her past relationships and switched between how much she loved him and his family to how they all deserved to die and were going to hell. But with the information given by the girl who had purchased Ike and by Pam's roommates, the police finally had sufficient evidence to search Pam's apartment. I don't know too much about what they found, but what I do know horrified my family and me. On Pam's computer, they found hundreds upon hundreds of pictures of my brother, my parents, Kara, and of me. Our cars, our houses, my school, my brother's school, of Ike, pictures taken through our windows at night, pictures of us sleeping, photos taken from our social media of vacations, the picture of my brother's proposal to Kara. She had even doctored herself into some of them. She still had pictures of her and my brother and her with my family up around her room too. She had kept Ike in her closet for weeks on a towel and with just water and a little bit of food. In her search history, they found everything from a rape fantasy and other violent pornography to weapon research. And the police now had sufficient evidence to arrest Pam. Pam had obviously been stalking my family for more than 2 years at this point. She had stalked us from her car, following us around town, and it had been her snapping photos of me from the roof outside of my window. She had documented her opinions of us, our habits, and her plans in a journal, which we'll not get to see until the case is taken to trial next month. My brother, myself, my father, the girl we found Ike with, Pam's roommates, several of my brother's friends, and Pam's mother will testify against her. It will be the first face-to-face interaction that any of us will have had with her in many months, and to be quite frank, I'm pretty terrified. And I'm angry too. I'm angry that an evil, narcissistic, malevolent, psychotic parasite like her had latched onto my brother, onto my family, and single-handedly stripped us of our security, our sanity, and our trust. Every creak and every bump, every unknown face, and every vehicle following too closely will send me into a tailspin of dread, and I'll see her again, standing in my front yard in a dress, just looking up at the sky with a vacant, animalistic gaze. My life became a real horror story. Not because of a haunted house or because of an axe-wielding murderer, but because of a sick girl with a broken mind and a fixation on something unobtainable. I'm 17 years old now, and I've experienced an ordeal most will read and think is just a sad attempt at a thrilling fiction post. My family is healing, and I'm healing, and she didn't break us. I hope that this story helps anyone who has gone through something similar feel not so alone. I hope that those of you who listen to this and think of someone who shows the same warning signs as Pam did are now prepared to take action to protect yourselves. But don't wait until things get as bad as they got for me. Be aware of the power of mental instability and the danger behind it. As our trial happens and we learn more, I may try and update you guys too. I can't thank you all enough for listening to this, and I'm relieved to have written it all out and just got it all off my chest. The past 6 years of my life have honestly just been a living hell. But I know that I'm stronger for it.